I always enjoy speaking to the afternoon group because they're devoted, they're dedicated, and like me, they tend to become a little dreamy during this session. So I hope you'll stay awake with me. I told Nancy that if you'll wake me up, if you'll stay awake, I'll stay awake. I'll make that promise to you. Let me tell you a little bit about the background on my development of this lesson tonight, or this afternoon, rather. I just spent a weekend in Querétaro, Mexico, and they were trying to focus on the family. And I was asked to develop a lesson that would pertain to young people and older people alike when it comes to plans for marriage, institution of marriage, and even enjoying the marriage institution in life and the bond of matrimony. So in many respects, it's a very personal lesson, but at the same time, it's very biblically oriented. And hopefully the things that I say tonight will help young people as they perhaps are planning to be married or contemplating the marriage in the near future. For those who are now in marriage and enjoying the wonderful relationship that you have with your spouse, and perhaps some like myself who have lost our spouse and are now experiencing what it is like to go through being a widow or a widower. So naturally, it's going to be quite personal in many respects. When I was younger, and Johnny Ann and I had been married for a short period of time, I would sit in amazement as I talked to people who had been married for 10 or 15 years, 20 years. I was astonished to those who had been married for 30 years, and then I was absolutely amazed to come across people who had been married for 50, 60, 70 years. In fact, one elderly couple in Ada, Oklahoma had been married 78 years. He must have robbed the cradle literally. And I would think to myself, 80 years, those of us who are now up in years and have experienced a number of years of marriage, or even if you're single, you know how fast life passes. When I was in the military, I was encouraged to re-up after 4 years of service, and he would say, the recruiter would say, in 16 more years, you can retire. And I'm thinking in my mind, I will be 38 years of age. I'll be worn out. But isn't it interesting how our perspective changes as time goes by? Johnny Ann and I were married for 51 years, 2 months, 5 days, 4 hours, and 22 minutes. And if I were to describe my marriage to you, I would tell you that it was a perfect marriage. I'm not suggesting that any marriage is absolutely void of problems and challenges, because if I were to do that, I would probably lie about other things as well. Like many of you, we lost our spouse through disease or something that we considered to be an invasion upon the good health, the good bodies that God gives to us. But whether it's through some illness or process wherein we go through a sickness, ultimately every one of us are going to suffer the ravages of time, are we not? And age is going to take its toll, for there is an appointment that the Hebrews writer constantly reminds us of as we read and study God's Word, that death is appointed. It's an appointment, and after that comes the judgment. So it's not something that we can avoid altogether. It is something that we endure, and even as we enjoy the marital relationship, you're part of one of 3 institutions that God has given to us. There is the institution of the government, there is the institution of the church, and there is the institution of the home. And 2 of those, the church and home, in many respects are a taste of heaven to come. And God has said to us, I want you to enjoy life. And He knows that man was not intended to be alone, and so He gave unto us the woman. And as is recorded in that first home in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, for this cause shall a man leave his mother and his father, and in so doing they shall cleave to one another. I'm going to take you on a journey tonight. It's not going to be very long. There's only 6 chapters in this journey, and if I were writing a journal, I would put a title at the head of each one of these chapters, and there will be a last chapter. I'll get to that when I get to it as the journey continues, and we'll explain that. So I'm just going to present this as if we're writing a journal over a period of time for those who are contemplating marriage, going to take us all the way through life up until the present state, to those who may have lost their loved ones along the way. I'm going to entitle this first chapter, In the Beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That first verse in the Old Testament sums up and encapsulates all that is around us: time, space, matter, force, action. You've heard the scientific references in that particular verse. But I'm going to choose three words out of that verse and make a little bit different application. In the beginning, God. And plans for marriage, that has to be at the beginning, first and foremost. My plans for marriage were shaped over a period of a number of years, like many of you, raised in a Christian home. I was taught the biblical principles that have to do with marriage and matrimony in general, and faithfulness and dedication to one's spouse, long before I ever met my spouse. Even as a young teenager, I was taught certain things about the institution of marriage and the permanence of marriage. And so I recognized, as I contemplated and planned for that moment when I would find someone in my life that I would spend the rest of my life with, at the basis of that was God. It was God. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things will be added unto you, is not a passage that just applies to one aspect of your life. I'm going to apply that to my church aspect. I'm going to be doctrinally pure. Yes, it applies to that, but it applies to every walk of life, every aspect of life. And that applies to the marriage institution as much as it applies to other walks of life. Before the wedding vows are ever said, before you even choose a spouse, before you ever say the words "I do," or you slip the finger upon the hand of the one that you plan to marry, behind all of that needs to be this attitude: in the beginning, God. And even though we sometimes contemplate marriage, I wonder if we seriously think about the foundation of marriage that's either going to make it or break it. And one of the elements right at the top of this list is that you seek a spouse that thinks the way you do spiritually. How often have we said, marry a Christian? Because if you marry a non-Christian, you immediately interject an element into your marriage that's going to cause problems. Because if your spouse does not think the way you think about the church, does not think the way you think about the plan of salvation, about prayer, about the scriptures, about your responsibility toward God, you've already introduced an element into the marriage that can only, as Job, in the words of Job, yet trouble cometh. That's all it can produce. And some, though they have married non-Christians, I wouldn't say it's a sin, but I think I would say it's very, very unwise to marry a non-Christian because of the element you introduce into that marriage. God recognized that. And the Bible teaches that I'm to make sure that I put it the first before I ever plan for marriage, ever plan for my occupation, ever plan for any aspect of my life. At the beginning of that has to be God, in the beginning. That's first chapter. Here's second chapter. As you contemplate marriage and you enter into marriage, we might use these words: Mr. Right, Miss Wonderful. Mr. Right, Miss Wonderful. We're living in a strange world today in which the biblical basis for marriage in many respects has been taken out of marriage. It's sort of a smorgasbord, grab whatever you can aspect in choosing a mate. And if you look across the broad perspective of quantity, there are more people living today than there were 50 years ago when Johnny Ann and I got married, and longer than that for some of you. The quantity was not as high. But here's the point to be emphasized in this. It is not who you marry, but the attitude with which you marry that person. The quantity is still great and even greater, but I'm stressing here the quality of the one that you married. And this is very closely connected to the first point that I made. What is the quality of those that we are seeking to marry? And will that quality allow the marriage then to have, to endure, to see many years of happiness and joy in the home? You know, in some countries, they still practice arranged marriages. It's not as strict as it was, say, a century ago. I asked Nehemiah Goodham one time when I was in India. We were talking about marriage, and he said they're still arranged here, and particularly among the Hindus, but even among some of the Christians. They're not as strict as they were 100 years ago, but there still is this concept of arranged marriages. And this may surprise you. In some of those countries like India and China and even in some of the Muslim countries where arranged marriages are made, and I'm not approving the social or the religious background of any of those. I'm just saying the statistics for divorce is remarkably low. Did you know in China the divorce rate among prearranged marriages is something like 2%, 3%? And it's not much higher than that in other countries that have prearranged marriages. But in America and in the Western world, it's a little bit different. Children grow up with the concept, I can choose who I want. I'm free to marry the person that I desire. And so they go out into this quantity pool of what's available, sometimes with little concern about the quality. Now, if you interject the quality on that, the quality of who you're looking to marry, times are changing still. After World War II, our country entered into a period of time in which the quality of marriage basically was understood. Am I marrying a person who believes in the Bible, believes in God, believes in the permanence of the vows of the marriage? That when you say one man for one woman for life, you meant that. When you stood before the altar and the vows were taken and you said, I take this man or I take this woman for better or for worse, in sickness or in health. And then when the ring is slipped on the finger and the I do is said, it was permanent. The word divorce did not even enter into the equation. And as time has passed in our country, the effect of the absence of God has started to take its toll in a most remarkable way. The divorce rate has risen just exponentially based on how we've kept God in our society. Prior to World War II, the divorce rate was something like 1 in 10. After World War II, it began to rise to 2 and 3 in 10. It slowed down during the 50s and the early 60s for the simple reason that we turned our attention to building homes and families. We were the family society. But when the sexual revolution came along in the 1960s and humanism and modernism and postmodernism began to grind away at the values in our country, we began to lose sight of those important principles that produce stability in the marriage. So not only do I have to put God into my life, I have to make sure that I'm looking at the right quality. And in our day and age, if the quality is for one who is spiritually minded, then the quantity today is much less than it was 50 years ago. That pool has shrunk. One of the things that I was asked to incorporate into my lesson was this, and this is where the title for this lesson tonight comes. Is your wait for the right person, is it going to be worth the wait? And if you put God first, and you make sure that your quality in marriage is what it should be, you're choosing from the right bank of prospects, if you will, then when life is over or you've gone through years and years of marriage, you'll be able to say, it was worth the wait. It was worth the wait. And you'll say that with such fond memories instead of bitter memories. Here's the third chapter in this journal that we're taking, or this trip that we're taking. And I'll use the title, I Never Gave You a Rose Garden. I never gave you a rose garden. Rose gardens are not without thorns. I have two beautiful rose bushes right outside the front door, and Johnny Ann used to sit in the living room and she would look out the window, and she loved those rose bushes. And I would try to clip one, but almost inevitably, every time I tried to clip a rose off the rose bush, I'd get a puncture with a thorn. Life is not filled with roses. There are the thorns that come along. We talked about that this morning. Or as BJ, as your grandson would sum it up, life is hard and then you die. Out of the mouth of babes sometimes. But you don't have a rose bush all the way through your marriage. You know, when Johnny Ann and I got married, I thought, I'm not going to have any problems. Not me. Not us. Everything's going to be rosy. Life is just going to be filled with the same kind of intensity and joy that we had on the honeymoon. But we woke up to reality in very short order, as many of you realize in your married life. Because with every wonderful blessing comes great responsibility. And the rose garden can last. It can be a permanent part of your life if you keep God first and if you choose the right mate. You see how this progresses? Because there are going to be issues in married life that you're going to have to deal with. In-law relationships, getting adjusted to each other, financial problems, children are going to come along. It's going to be filled with challenges. And unless I can build my marriage on God and His Word out of the right quality, I'll not be able to say I've had a rose garden. But if you do, at the end of life's journey, as the years roll by and you enjoy that marital bliss that God intended for you to enjoy, you'll be able at the end of that journey or anywhere in that journey to be able to say it was worth the wait. Here's chapter 4, the Honeymooners Forever. There was a sitcom in the 1950s that many of you who are older in years will remember, the Honeymooners. And it starred Jackie Gleason. He played the part of a man by the name of Ralph Cramden. His wife's name was Alice. And Ralph Cramden was the opposite of what it means to be a loving husband. He was the epitome of what not to do. But, you know, even in the period that TV series ran, I think it was 1 year, 39 episodes is all that were included in that. But even in the midst of his mistreatment of Alice, there were moments when he would show his tender side and he would express his love to her. I'm not suggesting that you be like the man who says to his wife, look, I told you I loved you, and if I ever change my mind, I'll let you know. You can treat your spouse in a wonderful way, but you have to express that with words and actions and deeds. Johnny Ann and I often said to each other, I love you, 3 words before we departed, when we came together again. For all we knew, it may be the case that as I'm walking out the door, that will be the last time that I would ever see her. And so we spoke those words often, we spoke them generously, and I'm suggesting that if you want to build a strong marriage and it be worth the wait, don't be afraid to say to your spouse, I love you, and say it often. Express that in such a way that it comes from your heart. There was a movie that was put out by Walt Disney some time back entitled Enchanted, and it's a cute movie. It was a musical, and there was one song in there that really was very touching. It was where this imaginary woman that came out of fantasy land into real life, she was trying to say something to this man that she was talking to. How do you know if somebody loves you? How do you tell them? It has to be with words and with actions and deeds. Here's a little clip of some words out of that song, that theme song that was sung during that movie. How does she know that you really, really, truly love her? It's not enough to take the one you love for granted. You must remind her, or she'll be inclined to say, how do I know he loves me? How do I know he's mine? Well, does he leave a little note to tell you? You're on his mind. Does he send yellow flowers when the sky is gray? He'll find a way to tell you. But you have to communicate that. Marriage can be a honeymoon forever. That doesn't mean you don't have difficulties. But that great love and that emotion that drew you together, it can last over the years. 30, 40, 50 years. As you express that love. And if you express that love and you build that marriage relationship, as the years roll by, you'll be able to say to one another, it was worth the wait. It's worth the wait. Here's chapter 5. And this chapter is very likely the most bitter in all the chapters in this journey. And I've entitled this one, The Last Farewell. It's not very often, in fact, it's a small fraction of percentage where husband and wife die at the same time. The point is that somebody is going to die first. And Johnny Ann and I discussed this on numerous occasions, and I would always say to her, I hope that you die first, not because I'm saying that from a selfish standpoint, but I was saying that because I did not want her to have to endure what I know would be the inevitable. But the point in this is that some of us, one of us, is going to bid the last farewell to the other. The other, it's going to be the gates into eternity and to heaven if they've been faithful Christian. But one of us is going to state the last farewell, and it will be bitter. And the point is, as the years roll by and the time comes to say that last farewell, will you be able to say in that last farewell, it was worth the wait? Will she or he, your spouse, be able to say to you, it was worth the wait? The time to express that love is now. Don't wait till the last farewell, but if you express it now, then you will be able to express it at the last farewell, will you not? Here's a poem I came across in an old publication titled The Minister's Monthly. This comes from the 1971 September issue. It's written by Mrs. C.R. Ballou. Don't wait to give flowers till some lonely soul has gone. Give them while he's living. Time passes swiftly on. Kind words that are timely spoken, flowers that are given today, may heal some heart that's breaking or brighten someone's way. So don't wait to give your flowers. Tomorrow may be too late. The soul you meant to comfort may have passed beyond the gate. Don't forget the aged whose footsteps have nearly reached their goal. A bouquet with a hearty smile will do wonders for the soul. The years will roll by. And when the time comes that you have to bid the last farewell, if all these other factors are in place, then what's going to happen? You're going to be able to look back and say to this one to whom you're bidding farewell, it was worth the wait. It was worth the wait. Chapter 6, this is the last one. This is the journey continues. Loss of a spouse is not the end of life. In many respects, it's the beginning of a whole new chapter in your life. There are challenges that go with it, no doubt, but the journey's going to continue. I've known people who have grieved themselves into an early grave. This gentleman in Decatur, Texas, where I preached, his wife died, and within 3 months he was dead. No physical ailments whatsoever. He just grieved himself to death. But life can go on, and you can find fullness in life beyond the loss of a spouse. That's part of the journey. But there are some ways that you need to think, and in many respects we're going to be coming full circle on this, because in many respects how you think after the loss of a spouse is the way that you ought to be thinking before you ever get a spouse. Let me give you 4 suggestions. Number 1, you've got to think soberly. So many times people enter into relationships without thinking about it. Young people, old people, middle-aged people. We just don't think soberly. And yet we are reminded by the Apostle Paul that in the things in our life we are to think soberly. Romans chapter 12 and verse 3. Don't rush into a relationship, but at the same time, if your desire is to marry, think soberly before you enter into that. Count the cost, as in so many other things. Here's a second thought about this as the journey continues. You need to think hopefully. Don't give up hope. At any point in life, when the little bit of counseling that I've done over the years, people would come in distraught for one reason or another. I've had people determine they're going to commit suicide. And the one message I try to convey to them is there is hope. There is nothing that is hopeless if you have God on your side. The late B.C. Goodpasture described hope like this. I think it's a wonderful description. He said, in the hour of bleak adversity, hope holds forth the heartening prospect of something better later on. It's hope that gives wealth to the beggar in the quest of alms, victory to those in the dust and ashes of defeat, freedom to the galley slave chained to his oar, release to the prisoner in his cell, health to the sick upon whose faded cheek has settled the hectic flush of death. It is hope that saves the Christian when the bitter night of utter helplessness settles over him. It is hope that brings to him the promise of life and the presence of death. It happens to the humblest saint that in the night of death, hope sees a star and listening love hears the rustle of a wing. It is hope that enables the believer to say tomorrow in response to earth's last good night. It is hope that makes death a narrow starlit strip between the separation of yesterday and the fond reunion of tomorrow. I'll never see Johnny Ann in the capacity in which we enjoyed in this life. I'll never see her in that capacity, but I will see her again. And it is the hope of the reunion with loved ones that Paul, when he wrote to the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, when he said, weep not as those who have no hope. And whether it's the loss of a loved one or any other tragedy in life, you've got to think hopefully. Think soberly and think hopefully. Here's a third thing. You need to follow the advice of the Apostle Paul. Whatsoever things are good, whatsoever things are honorable, whatsoever things are just, if there be any virtue, any praise, think on these things. As I continue the journey through life, and as some of you continue the journey through life, whether it's with the loss of a spouse or perhaps the complete incapacitation of your spouse, you think on things that are good, things that are hopeful, things that are joyful. And then here's one last suggestion, and that is think on the memories. God made us capable of remembering. I'm glad for that. I'm glad that I can remember times when Johnny Ann and I spent together, and those memories are sweet. But you know what makes them sweet? It is that we began our journey putting God in our life first, far before she and I ever met. She wanted to marry a preacher. I wanted a woman who would be a preacher's wife, and God in His providence brought us together. But the thing is, you think on memories because it's the memories of those things that sometimes sustain you. And that's why with the sweet memories and the loss even of a spouse, I can still look back and I can say it was worth the wait. I want to ask you a question as we close this. As you look at your relationship with your wife, or any relationship for that matter, but particularly with your wife, you've often heard it said that delayed gratification brings the greatest gratification. It does. It'll be worth the wait if you put God into your life and keep Him there throughout the years as those years and decades roll by. And when life comes to its close, whether it's before or after your spouse has left, you'll be able to say it was worth the wait. You know, the home is very much like heaven. It's a taste of heaven. And all the joys that we have in our home life, God wants you to have that in eternity. He wants you to be His child. That's why He extends the invitation. And His expression that He loves us is much like the expression of a husband who says to his wife, I love you. The Great Commission in Matthew 28, go ye therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. Now listen to how this closes. And I am with you always, even to the end of the world. That was not tacked on to the Great Commission to make some kind of a great poetic ending. What is that? Every year, generation after generation, we read that Great Commission and we close with those words. And what are those words? It is God saying, I love you. I love you, the church. And He wants you to be a part of it. And when you obey the gospel, hearing, believing, repenting, confessing, and then being baptized into Christ, you'll have those sweet words of Jesus repeatedly throughout the years saying, I love you, and I will be with you. And when life's journey comes to an end as a Christian, you'll be able to look back and say, it was worth the wait. Would you become a Christian tonight? If you're not a faithful Christian, would you be restored and keep the words of Jesus in mind? He loves you. Please respond as together we stand as we sing. I know